Hi everyone, welcome back to our Philosophy of Happiness class. So for this lecture, we'll talk about disability, health, and well-being. We'll talk about phenomenology as well. So I will link another resources which gives detailed explanation of Merleau-Ponty's theory and phenomenology in general. So I'll try not to kind of be too caught up with the explanation of those, but be more focused on the paper and on how the idea of phenomenology and Merleau-Ponty's work are relevant to the questions we're discussing here. So a lot of these would be based on the Caravel paper, since the textbook chapter, which is, I think it is written in a pretty straightforward way. It shouldn't require a lot of explanation there. Although, if you have questions about that textbook chapter and if you want to talk about it more, just feel free to email me or share your thoughts in the discussion posts. So let's get started with this lecture. So firstly, I want to highlight that the ways how people use those terms illness, disease, disability, health, or sickness are pretty chaotic. So if you are reading literature that's on those concepts and terms, or use those concepts and terms, especially if it's a philosophy of medicine paper or a philosophy of well-being paper, it's very important that you look for a clarification of how they're using those words, so what they mean by those words. So for instance, some philosophers have made a distinction between illness and disease, arguing that, okay, disease is just about the biological side, while illness also kind of encompasses the social and kind of the experiential context of that disease individual. It also it's just more contextual, but people have disagreed with these distinctions as well. So this isn't a final distinction. People might use those words differently from those philosophers. People have also argued that, okay, disabled people are not necessarily unhealthy, and disabled people are not necessarily disease. So there have been a literature on distinguishing between disease and disability, or trying to separate those two and making the distance between those two words longer. And people have also written extensively on the concept between health and disability and how they are related to each other. And people have also argued that people have also argued that chronic disease or chronic illness are different from shorter term illness and disease. So as you can see, people have done a lot of different works using these, and they disagree with each other how we might use those terms. So I hope you didn't get more lost because of the explanation just now. So what I'm just saying here, each person could be using these terms differently. But if they are a good philosopher, if they're a professional, they will clarify how they're using those words and what they mean by those words at the start of their work, before they start arguing for their conclusions, before they start their analysis. So I would suggest that not to look for a final kind of definition, a kind of most privileged distinction between these terms, since everyone will be using them differently. What you can do is just to keep in mind that always look for clarification at the start of each paper for each philosopher's work, and keep in mind how they're using those words and just focus on that. So just so if you feel those concepts are a bit chaotic for you, just don't worry, that's not your problem. That's not because you are not understanding it well enough. Of course not. And if you are writing on those terms, if you are writing your final paper on those topics, then it's very important that you give a clear definition of what you mean by illness. When you are using this word, what kind of things do you consider as including illness, and what you exclude from those definitions, and why, and how you are using this term. So just be very clear how you're using these terms and what you mean by those terms. And you can, of course, appeal to existent kind of conceptions, existent kind of theoretical work of trying to distinguish between these. But you have to be very clear which version of it you are endorsing. And just be very specific, very clear. And if a philosopher fails to do this, then you can, of course, write a paper to attack that, to critique that, because a professional philosopher should do that before their paper. So that's on those terms. And more could be read in the textbook chapter and in the paper, so I won't try to explain each theoretical work of making those clear in the history of philosophy. So I think another two kind of terms I want to explain are naturalism and normativism. So naturalism, I think, or if we argue that a disease concept that's more naturalistic, we are talking more about conceptions of disease that's just about the biological aspects of the disease, that just focuses on the biological facts, or empirical facts. And when we talk about normativism, then it would be an account of disease that appeals to moral standards, that appeals to moral conceptions, that appeals to normative judgments and theories and standards. And today I want to talk about Carroll's theory, which tries to combine a naturalistic account with a phenomenological approach. So note that although Carroll's theory argues that naturalistic account doesn't give the complete story, it is not complete. It's not trying to replace naturalistic account, rather it's trying to augment naturalistic account. It's trying to develop naturalistic account and combine it with phenomenological approach. And Carroll argues that if we combine those two approaches, we would arrive at a complete story of disease and health. So firstly, Carroll's paper is based a lot on Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology and phenomenological approach. So Merleau-Ponty kind of makes this distinction between the lived body and the biological body. So firstly, I'll explain what the lived body is. So the lived body is the media through which I apprehend and understand the world and interact with it. And it always exhibits intentionality in this lived body. So my lived body always aims at a goal by directing itself towards an object. It demonstrates a dynamic relationship between my body and the world. Or in other words, it's the aspect of my body which kind of exhibits my intentionality and agency, and it's a kind of demonstrating site for me to kind of demonstrate and live and embody my dynamic relationship with the world. And it's this medium. I know this explanation sounds confusing because for Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, we have to come back to his original theoretical setting and explain what that's like in the theoretical setting. So I only do this explanation like this here, but I'll link a further resources. So if you haven't watched that resource, feel free to do that afterwards. that should help you with understanding this concept of lived body. And then, of course, there is the biological body. So for Merleau-Ponty, the lived body and the biological body combined together would be the embodied body. So Merleau-Ponty's account tries to bring the kind of bodily aspect of our body experience and the kind of mental aspect of our bodily experience. And again, so therefore, in Merleau-Ponty's eyes, illness is not simply a problem of an isolated physiology, but a problem of relationship between the whole embodied body and the world. So actively being in the world and interacting with the world. So it's not just about what's going wrong with my physiological making up. It's also a problem of my relationship with the world kind of changed, and maybe I now encounter a lot of difficulties in terms of how I form my relationship with the world and how I live in the world and how I interact with the world. So here are two aspects to the problems as well. Or if you try to understand this concept of lived body, think about me living in this world. I'm not static. I'm a dynamic person that has so many different intentions and goals and actions kind of every minute. And the lived body tries to capture this aspect of me being this dynamic person that's not just a static passive body, but a dynamic person that tries to interact with the world. And the lived body is just this aspect of me, this aspect of my body, through which I interact with the world, I understand the world, I actively be in the world. So if we understand illness this way, this highlights the relationship between the agency of individuals and their bodies. This highlights the idea that we have agency, we're active, living agents in the world. We are not just static, passive bodies as objects in this world. And if you endorse this conception of illness, then you would be able to realize and describe how the world changes for individuals. So a merely biological, naturalistic conception of disease and way of understanding disease, it just won't capture these information. So what more information could we capture? So firstly, we capture how the world changes for individuals. So when we just kind of come into this new stage of living with, for instance, a chronic disease or disability, we will experience transformation of fundamental concepts such as distance, time, and space. So for instance, if I live in a wheelchair, then how I experience distance would be different from other people who don't live in a wheelchair. It also transforms our social world. So for instance, if I now live in a wheelchair, I won't be able to maybe go to the basketball sports group I originally have. So there would be change to my community and relationship with the world. Or maybe because I now experience some kinds of chronic illness, now the relationship with people around me, with my family and my partner will change. Then there may be changes to my financial status. There may be changes to the loss of participation in some activities. There may be stigma. But also highlight that the changes don't have to be always negative. So sometimes there might be positive changes for people. So that's kind of up for individuals' interpretation. Some people might find and report, which has happened. So sometimes people might report that they experience certain transformation for fundamental concepts in social world that are actually pretty positive and beneficial for them. So people have reported that as well. So we shouldn't assume. For for people. And so for people who have chronic illness and permanent disability, they will experience permanent alterations in terms of these aspects. So if we endorse Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological approach and framework, and we can now capture those information, those fundamental changes, we are now equipped with better describing the altered worlds and the altered relationship with the worlds of those people who come into chronic illness and permanent disability, and those people who experience illness and disability in general. And Carroll argues that if we could better describe those, we should now have a more complete account of the good life. We should give this better account of the good life. So Carroll thinks that we weren't having the complete story beforehand. It's only after we endorse Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological approach, we can now have those information available to us. We can have those descriptions that are available to us, and now we can tell a more advanced, complete story of well-being. And recall the distinction between biological body and lived body. So, okay, now we are endorsing Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological framework. How is that relevant to disability? How should we analyze the cases of chronic illness and disability with that framework? So, Carroll argues that when we experience illness, there exists a gap between the biological body and the experience of the lived body. Illness splits apart the biological and the lived body. So, for instance, anorexia. So for those people who experience anorexia, their biological body would be underweight, so they would objectively weigh 6 stone. But their lived experience would be, but they would live with a lived experience someone who is overweight, who needs to lose weight. So also illness can make our lived body alienated in a lot of different ways. Our biological body is still our biological body, but now I have all these feelings of alienation. And I actually feel strange to my own body. So those are all examples of my experience of the lived body and the biological body coming apart. And in such scenarios, there are movements of relationship between the biological and the lived bodies. However, those movements are not necessarily bad. So Carroll argues that those movements can create potential where we can do things like creatively reform the relationship. We can creatively reinterpret the relationship. We can tell new stories out of the relationship. We can do a lot of different things to shape this movement. We are not passive static subjects to just wait for destiny to tell us how this movement should look like. We can do so many different things. We have agency, we have space to actually shape this movement. So there is a lot of potential of shaping this movement. And Carroll argues that this is why we want to adopt phenomenology, because phenomenology as a tool just makes a lot of descriptions available to us. It makes us now aware of those aspects of living. Phenomenology is this great tool to help us think about this relationship in this more enlightened way. And Carroll argues that, okay, here we have this potential of shaping this movement. And what do? We adapt. So here would be this process of adaptation happening, where adaptation can be physical, psychological, social, and temporal. They are highly personal and creative. And I'll give you some examples of each of them. So for in terms of physical adaptation, so maybe I now have shorter breath, or now I can walk for shorter length. But I might find creative ways to breathe that helps me to cope with my shorter breath, or I might find ways to walk that best preserves my energy. I might find ways to actually make so if I could walk for shorter length, of course walking would be more tiring for me, but I might find ways to make walking a distance interesting and rewarding for myself, and encourages myself to do these, right? I might find ways to better allocate my energy and find ways to creatively preserve my energy, so on and so forth. So I might find a lot of physical strategies to actually do things. I might breathe in ways that are different from how I breathed before, which actually made breathing easier for me, which actually partly resolved my breathing problems. And my breathing a certain gesture that I just come up with that helped with the pain, so on and so forth. Or the adaptation can be psychological. So I might find new ways to tell my story. So I might have new understanding and conceptions of myself. Or so I think one famous example could be Beethoven, who went deaf after after some parts of his musical journey. And I think Beethoven was able to kind of come up with this new narrative. Okay, I can't die yet because I have all these music within me that I have to tell. And then becoming deaf shouldn't be an obstacle to that. And I still have all this music I want the world to hear, and I will bring them out to the world because they're valuable. Or there was this famous advertise I used to see that's from Thailand. Someone who can't hear, someone who has suffered from hearing loss, who falls in love with the violin and tries to learn to play the violin. And there was this famous sentence in the advertise that the girl's teacher told her. So the girl was very sad because she couldn't hear, and then she had struggled a lot with learning the violin. But her teacher told her that only when you close your eyes you can see the music, you can hear the music in your heart, through your heart, not through your ears. So again, those are ways people can psychologically adapt to those chronic illness and disability, right? There might be social adaptations, right? For instance, you might meet new friends, you might join new support groups, you might communicate with your partner and talk about your worries, concerns, and feelings, and find ways to reshape your relationship and your life. Or you might find creative strategies to actually make your conditions kind of compatible with some of the scenarios or communities or contexts you used to have. Or your kind of understanding of the world, your temporal kind of sensitive of the world will also adapt to your conditions in different ways. And another example of adaptation is the extended body. So maybe I suffer from great memory loss, but now I have this notebook that I carry with me all the time, that I basically just write down every thing I experience. I just write down every memory, every thought I have just on this book. So maybe that's kind of an extended part of my body. Or maybe for the blind people, they might have kind of walking sticks that also act as parts of extended bodies to them. You can also use a lot of things creatively as an extended body. You can develop a wide range of things in creative ways, and make them become your extended bodies. So coming back to what Carol said, this process is very creative. As a person, as an active agent who has agency, we just can do so many things to creatively react to, find strategies for, or reinterpret the conditions and limitations we have. And maybe at the end of the day, for a disabled person or a person who live with long-term chronic illness, they might find adaptations that are great, that extensions of their bodies that are great. They might shape their relationship with the world, the relationship between their biological and living body, in very creative and beautiful ways. And as a result, they might report that their well-being are actually great. Their level of well-being are actually as great as someone who doesn't suffer from chronic illness and disability. So I guess what Carol is highlighting here is the kind of agency we might have. And I think here we can actually try to kind of make use of our imagination and think about how creative people can get when they try to come up with strategies and stories and ways to kind of reshape their relationship with the world. And I think the important message Carrie is sending here is that we have to recognize that. We have to recognize that kind of power and agency in people. And I think this paper was very meaningful to me, and personally, it was one of the most important papers I think I've read doing philosophy. I think when we do a philosophy of well-being, I feel like it's so important that we recognize such agency, such creativity, such kind of power people have within them, that we recognize that people are those alive, active, kind of personal, wonderful living beings that just respond to this kind of chaotic world in their own ways, in their own active ways. I just feel like I just find that really beautiful and just find that very meaningful to me while I do philosophy. And also I feel like Carol's paper also might force us to rethink some of the theories we've talked about. So think about hedonism. We talk about pain and pleasure. So is pain necessarily bad for us? Is displeasure necessarily bad for us? If we think about Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological approach, and if we think about Carol's theory, it seems that the story could be a bit oversimplified, right? So you might also think about bringing this phenomenological perspective, this new approach, this recognition of people's agency and people's context and their relationship with the world and the relationship with themselves. You might actually bring this approach and combine this approach with any other well-being theories we've talked about in this class. And you might adopt this perspective and rethink some of the previous theories. So if you try to do that, and if you're interested in do that, or maybe some of you have been doing that in your mind when you were reading those papers this week. So I'm really curious about your thoughts, and I really look forward to discuss them more with you guys in the discussion space. And I just think this would be a very meaningful project as well. And maybe at the end of the day, some of the theories we've covered are actually oversimplified, or maybe they are not. So I think this would be a space where a lot of interesting and wonderful questions can come out of. So I really look forward to explore this with all of you more. So this will be the lecture on disability, health, and well-being. And I think the message we've talked about in Kara's paper, it actually applies to this topic of being healthy in general. And I think it applies to the case of mental health. I think it can apply and extend to a lot of topics within philosophy of well-being. So that would be a meaningful thing to think about, and it would be very interesting to think about as well. So here will be the lecture. This will be a lecture on philosophy of disability, health, and well-being for this week. And I look forward to see you again in the lectures next week. Wait, I realized I forgot to talk about this as well. So the health within illness concept. So I think this will be a very interesting concept to explore as well. So maybe health, it can be a subjective and personal and individual feeling. Maybe here ill people can experience a sort of subjective well-being as well. So that's the health within illness concept. And I think this also supports Carol's kind of talk that people who experience disability and chronic illness can indeed be happy. They are capable of experiencing health and well-being and happiness in a subjective, personal, individual way. So one example could be how people feel like illness wasn't necessarily bad for them, but served as a tool of self-discovery and a fundamental source of later self-development. So again, it would be very interesting that we focus on this subjective and personal notion of health, the subjective notion of health, and kind of see health not just as that kind of naturalistic biological concept, but also encompassing this subjective kind of personal kind of unfolding of health. So that would be the real end of the lecture now. See you again in the next lecture.